Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Today in the art world, while we regularly hear from artists about their practice or their work, we maybe not as often hear about their lived experiences as artists. And I think it's this type of insight that can be incredibly valuable, not only for emerging artists, but also even for more established ones who are eager to hear how others are navigating the art world. So in this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Lydia Figes, author of the new book, Survival Notes, Life Lessons from Contemporary Artists. In the book, Lydia moves far beyond the usual advice for artists. She uncovers how artists are actually living and working today, from the realities of the studio to the pressures of education, community, mentorship, and everything in between. And I think the book is relevant to an audience beyond artists. I think it's really for anyone in the art world: collectors, gallerists, curators, really anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what artists are experiencing today. In our conversation, we discuss why Lydia feels now was the right time to write this book, what surprised her most while speaking with artists about how they navigate the contemporary art world. We also get into the evolving role of art school, the value of mentorship, the tension between solitude and community, and other topics as well. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Lydia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, congrats again on the new book. I really enjoyed it and definitely recommend our listeners check it out. So your book, it doesn't just offer advice to artists. It gets into how they really live and work today, which I think is a really unique angle. What made you want to write this book, and why did it feel like the right time to dive into these stories with the artists you spoke with?
Yeah, so I've worked in the kind of art industry, if you like, for the last 10 years, and I've worked very closely with artists. And as part of my career, I've been an arts writer, so I interview lots of artists. And as a way to kind of lighten the end of an interview, I often like to ask artists, what advice would you give to your younger self? And it quickly dawned on me that artists really love that question. I think it's refreshing for an artist to be able to talk about the conditions of being an artist and the kind of motivating psychological factors that exist behind the professional facade of an artist. And I realized that the answers were really varied and nuanced, and I didn't feel that anyone answered necessarily in the exact same way. So there was a lot of rich kind of content I was gathering from these interviews. And then I think it was that compounded with the fact that we do live in an age and an economic climate that is quite hostile, especially for young artists or emerging artists, if you like, people trying to get a foot into the industry. So it sort of just made sense that we need a kind of generational dialogue between artists who maybe got their footing and became really established in the sort of 80s, 90s, early noughties, with artists coming into the market and into this kind of visual art landscape now, because the conditions of being an artist have radically changed because of the economy, because of technology, digital media, the kind of ecosystem of galleries and how that's changed. So I think, it was really about demystifying that process and trying to offer reassuring guidance, but also some kind of hard-hitting, transparent advice too.
And when you started having these conversations with artists, what surprised you most about how they're actually navigating the art world today? I think for many people who are not artists or perhaps gallerists, it's easier to know an artist through their work and their practice, but far harder to understand how they're actually navigating the art world on a personal level.
Yeah, it's a good question and a complicated one. I think one thing to take away, and which I hope is reassuring for younger artists trying to make it work and trying to survive, is that no matter how established and successful you may seem on the outside, from having conversations with some really prolific, renowned artists who by all means seem to have made it, in inverted commas, Artists still deal with self-doubt, they still deal with setbacks, self-scrutiny. I don't think the challenge of producing work and you're challenging your own practice ever really stops. And I think what's really key is accepting that the artist's journey in life isn't necessarily a linear one. Some artists might have a moment of hype early in their career, even when they've just left art school, and might find some commercial success only to realize that they can't keep up with the kind of market they've created for themselves and then fall into the kind of shadows for a while, only to then later have a resurgence of interest. Whereas other artists, and actually many of the most celebrated artists in history, sort of came into their practice and made a name for themselves quite late in life. That's actually quite a common sort of trajectory that I noticed upon doing the research and interviewing lots of artists. So I think that's important to remember that, there's no shame in continually working on your practice and finding enjoyment in that, but realizing that maybe you do need to have another income stream or to have other things going on in your life that you can fall back on. I don't think there's shame in that. And I think that is the reality for most artists today. It is a very volatile market and economic landscape, as we've seen this year in particular. So the life of an artist is quite uncertain, I guess, no matter how big you make it or how much your work sells for at auction. You might be an artist buying back your own work at auction to maintain your market one day. You never know. So yeah, I guess that's something I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And the book also looks at art schools and how different artists experienced it, from the intense crit culture to some of the financial pressures of paying for school. And I think, the whole art school question, it's something I don't speak about as often on the podcast, but it's definitely a conversation that I have regularly offline with artists and galleries. After all these conversations that you had, how do you see the role of art education today? And does it still serve artists in the way it claims to?
Yeah, it's a really tough one because on the one hand, I really do believe in education and higher education and that art and even learning about art history should be an academic pursuit and there should be depth to it. But yeah, it's a tragedy of our times that art school has become so corporatized, financialized, that really students are sort of being taken for a ride, I think. And I do completely sympathize with the frustration of young people who find themselves in huge amounts of debt that they might never be able to get out of. And in turn, the feeling of that debt, unless obviously you come from privilege and you can pay off your tuition fees or have support from family, etc. The pressure of having that debt might actually compromise the integrity of your work because you're just thinking about survival and you're thinking about how can I pay my rent? How can I pay for a studio? And how can I pay for art supplies, which are really expensive? So we're probably seeing a whole generation of talent being squeezed out of this sector because it's not really an option to live like a bohemian today. Like if you can't really live in the way that the Fluxus artists were working in like downtown New York or the kind of avant-garde artists in Paris in the 1920s when the cost of living was low. Like it's just not really possible anymore. So yeah, the art world becomes even more exclusive. It's even more impenetrable for people who don't come from wealth. Saying that, I do think that there are really valuable things to be taken from art school. The book sort of talks about other options for how to get into art school or afford tuition by going to, public schools or seeking opportunities in Europe, where there's a different kind of philosophy around higher education that actually waives tuition fees completely. And the cost of living it's certainly more affordable than what you have in the States. So I try to sort of emphasize other routes that are maybe less traditional or seen as less prestigious, but actually still hold a lot of value. And you might be able to work with some incredible professors and have a sort of tight-knit cohort and real dialogue with your peers. And I think one of the key takeaways from the kind of art school chapter where I spoke to people like Marilyn Minter and Anthony Gormley and lots of really incredible artistic figures is that art school, if you are lucky enough and can afford to go, it's really about building your community. I think that it might be the most important thing about that experience because in a way, if you put the time and effort and, educate yourself, art can be a self-taught thing. And again, lots of the best artists from history were self-taught. Basquiat, Frida Kahlo, Picasso to a large extent because he dropped out. So yeah, I think it's important to remember that the things that you might get from art school are not necessarily the most obvious lessons in the life of being an artist. But as John Baldessari said, the life and education of an artist takes a lifetime. It's not a 3-year degree. It's not a 4 or 5 year degree. You need a lot longer to come into your own and come into your practice. So it's not like you can just tick the box with one degree and then that sets you up. I think it's much more, it takes more time than that. So yeah, I think, and then sorry, just to make one more point, I think another key is that you don't have to go to art school aged 18, 19, or whenever, most people graduate from sixth form or what do you guys call it? High school? I don't
Exactly. Yeah,
know.
high school.
Yeah, like you can actually choose to go to art school slightly later in life and gain skills in other areas. The artist Christina Quales, who I interviewed in the book, who's an amazing artist, she did lots of training in kind of graphic design, and that was a sort of adjacent creative thing that obviously is more in demand in the job market. And that really set her up, and she did find enjoyment in it. And it kind of complemented her later visual artistic practice. So there's no shame in going to art school a bit later when you might have more stability or you really know how you want to build your portfolio and your practice as an artist.
Those are all really great insights. And did any of the artists talk about the network effect of art school, particularly the value of the relationships they build there with fellow students and how those connections can actually continue to shape their careers long after they graduate?
I think it's art school can be tough for some artists because maybe it's the first time you have a sense of competition in your work and you're sort of set up to compare yourself to your peers, especially with crits and how that works. And there's a sort of necessary building of resilience. So some artists kind of emphasized not getting trapped by that, not feeling like you need to go to every party or feel that you need to be the one shouting the loudest in the room or amongst your peer group, but you can quietly get on with your work and use that time to sort of make mistakes and create bad work even just to kind of get ahead. Whereas other artists really found a sense of community and put on sort of DIY exhibitions with their peers, and there's a sense of solidarity and general support. So I think it depends on the kind of context or year group you find yourself in. But I do think there's something to be said that often there'll be a particularly strong year group at an art school because you can see that the students are feeding off each other's energy and they're kind of inspiring each other or they're in a creative dialogue that's beneficial to everyone. I think that's quite often the case, which is interesting.
Yeah, I've noticed something like that as well, where it does seem from time to time certain schools produce a certain class of artists, and they all seem to be, or so many of them seem to be doing incredibly well, and they're friends with one another and go to each other's openings, and they sort of become this group of artists that are achieving a level of success. It's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. And I think that will be really key if you're an artist who maybe has a year or two or several years even of maybe being slightly in the wilderness after graduating, which is how most artists find themselves really. You might have some group shows or you might have some opportunities, but lots of artists who don't immediately find success or a gallery, for example, have put on their own shows, have kind of set their own table, if you like, and invited their friends and their peers to do that. So I do think that's something to really be aware of if you're going to go to art school, that you can set your own stage as well if opportunities don't come to you immediately. Like you can put the curator's hat on, you can create your own opportunities. Um, yeah, absolutely.
In the book, you also write a lot about mentorship and how important those types of relationships can be for an artist. I'm curious, what did artists tell you about the mentors who shaped them, and what makes a good mentor in the art world today? And if you could share some of the artists you spoke with, and maybe some had some surprising mentors, that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so the idea of mentorship was really kind of underpinning the book, because when I started the book, I was living on the same street as Rainer Marie Rilke, who was an Austrian poet who lived in the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century. And he famously is the author of a compilation of letters called Letters to a Young Poet, in which you see his correspondence with an aspiring poet called Capus, who had gotten in touch with him and asked for his sort of seasoned wisdom on how to live life as a poet, but also, as a kind of in a similar way, a struggling sort of artist. And so I was reading that and I was really thinking about this need for generational dialogue. And I think in this chapter, what became really apparent from speaking to people like Marilyn Minter, Alvaro Barrington, Ludovic North, is that actually mentorship can benefit the mentor and the mentee. It's a kind of mutually beneficial relationship, and it doesn't have to be dependent on age. And I have a really amazing quote by Alvaro Barrington on mentorship, which I can read out if you like, because I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, please do. That would be great.
Okay, so Alvaro Barrington, when he was talking about mentorship and why he thinks it's so important, he said that someone, he didn't name who, once said to him, if you want to be a great artist, you generally want to have three types of people in your life. Firstly, you need to be around artists who are much older than you, those from the generation before you, who can see the path you have yet to take and know how to guide you along that path. Secondly, you need to be around people who began their careers at the same time as you. They will share your perspective and see the new path forming ahead, the path that the older folks can no longer see. Thirdly, and finally, you'll need to surround yourself with younger people, the artists just starting out. The young ones are going to see things you can't even see, a completely new path that trails in your footsteps. Young people see what is necessary for change. If you could find a balance between all three, you're going to have the perspective of the past, present, and future. And I thought that was really beautifully put and extremely helpful, because I think he's right. I think you need the perspectives of many different types of people across generations. Because actually, at a certain point, well, maybe slightly older artists who, I don't know, have had their kind of moment of being hype and young, have stopped seeing things anew, or have stopped. They're no longer in the kind of conversations that have currency and fresh ideas. So I think you do see throughout history that artists who had been teachers and therefore mentors as well are often the ones who do more interesting things in their practice or can challenge themselves because they're listening to these different dialogues. So I think that's the key takeaway.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I don't think people really think about mentorship as being a huge deal for artists, but it clearly is. So, another theme that comes up in your book regularly is solitude, especially in contrast to how connected and online we are now. How did artists describe finding that balance between needing time alone in their studio and needing an art community?
Yeah, I think this is really key and crucial for an artist. I think the life of an artist does inevitably require solitude. Agnes Martin, who I featured heavily in that chapter, she said, solitude and freedom are the same. I suggest that people who like to be alone, who walk alone, will perhaps be serious workers in the field of art. And I think I agree. And I think that extends beyond visual art. I think that's for anyone who does anything that's creative and a sort of creative act that's not really asked for, or, like someone who wants to be a writer or someone who's a musician. I think you need to be able to lean into solitude and be replenished by it. and sort of see it as an active skill or thing that you need to train within your character, even and your kind of daily habits, so that you can apply yourself seriously to your practice. And I think that is one of the most challenging things that artists face today, because we live in an era of obsessive hyper connectivity. It's, we're all in some ways, I think, victims of the attention economy. We all have low-key addictions to our phones. And I do think that rewires our brains and capacities to have, interesting imaginations and kind of flex that creative muscle, if you like. So that chapter was a response to realizing that lots of artists I interviewed said that in their childhood they did spend a lot of time alone and enjoy being alone. I think that was a kind of unifying character trait amongst many of the artists that I spoke to. And yeah, I think there's a key distinction between loneliness, which suggests lack of something, and solitude, which I think maybe there is the same sort of social shame around living in solitude, but actually we can reframe it and think of it as absolutely necessary for a creative life. And it should be restorative and something to take pride in, even. Like, it means that you take your work and your mind and your creativity seriously. So it's about resisting the kind of messaging we have all around us, which is to constantly be visible and to connect with others, which I think can be harmful to the life of an artist.
So throughout all of these incredible conversations that you had with so many artists in order to write this book, you obviously gained a lot of knowledge about and perspective about what it's like to be an artist and what their experiences are like. On the podcast, we have many listeners who are artists. Many of them are younger, rising artists. Some are more established. But I'd be curious if you can share, based on everything you've learned and from all the conversations you had with artists, if you can share maybe one piece of advice or something that artists who are listening should take away from all the conversations that you had with these artists.
In a way, it's hard because the point of the book was also to kind of upend the idea that you can give one piece of advice, and that's why you have so many voices in the book, and some of which contradict each other. I think the book is asking you to see what other people say to certain things, what advice they'd give, and what wisdom they're happy to share, but that you can take away some aspects and disagree with others. So I think that's key, is remembering that there isn't a kind of cookie cutter, one size fits all approach to being an artist. And it is as annoying or frustrating as maybe this is to hear. It is about finding what works for you. But I do think that at the end of the day, I think you need to be asking yourself, why do I create? Why do I want to be an artist? Because if you're really honest with yourself and maybe you can admit that I want external validation, or I want the monetary benefits, perhaps, or I want to be, I don't know, yeah, maybe if you notice that you're applying more shallow metrics to your motivations to being an artist, that's something to think more on. And, there's no shame in some of those things necessarily, but if you want to be a great artist and if you want to maintain a sense of integrity and you're thinking in the way that many of these great artists from history were, I think it's questioning your motivations and your integrity behind your practice. And so long as you're being authentic to yourself and know that you're making work for the right reasons. And sometimes it's just as simple as making work because you love it, because you love the everyday act of creating. And I think that's something to be really proud of.
I think that's really excellent advice. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Lydia, thanks again for coming onto the podcast. We really enjoyed the conversation, and congratulations on your new book, Survival Notes, Life Lessons from Contemporary Artists. I definitely recommend our listeners check it out. They can get it on Amazon or wherever you buy books. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.